Hey guys, really glad you could be with us again for another study in this series, Red Letters, Words for a Broken World, for a Hurting World. I think that what we're going to be talking about tonight is particularly impactful. Of course, I think anytime we get into the words of Christ, all of them should be impactful, right? But last week, Jeff read out of John chapter 8. The woman who was caught in adultery. And he did such a great job of bringing about the fact that Jesus knew what was in a man. And of course, that's said verbatim in John chapter 2, verse 25. But, there's a lot, and Jeff talked about this on Sunday as well quite a bit, that God knows the heart of you. He knows our hearts. He knows our innermost thoughts and dreams and desires and everything about us, right? But I was thinking about that in conjunction with another theme and thread that is kind of its twin that happens throughout the book of John, which is the fact that most of the people did not know or recognize or receive Jesus. Yes, Jesus knew their heart, every person he came in contact with, and yet it was not reciprocated. They did not know him. So over and over again, he says, you don't know me, and so you don't know the Father. You don't even know where I come from, right? And so this is said in chapter 1, verse 10, chapter 4, verse 10, chapter 4, verse 22, 537, 728, 814, 819, 855, 929. All over the book of John, Jesus is telling a crowd or a person, you don't know me, and so you don't know the Father. And so by the time we get to chapter 10, which is a very well-known chapter about the good shepherd and the sheep, Jesus says, my sheep know my voice. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, and my sheep follow me. And so chapter 10 comes right after chapter 9. Surprise. But it's this chapter about the man who is born blind. And the question that starts out that chapter is, Rabbi, did this man sin or his parents sin that he is born blind? But really what John is getting at through this story, even though that's the question that the disciples ask, the question that John is answering in this story is not, did this man or his parents sin, which Jesus actually answers, right? But really the question that John is tackling is Jesus from God or not? Is Jesus a prophet or not? Is Jesus the Messiah or not? His sheep have been hearing him. They've been slowly recognizing him and following him. But the book of John really is more about those who did not recognize him and those that did not follow him. The prologue of John, right? Though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. At one point, a couple of chapters before this, they're talking about whether Jesus is the Messiah, and they're having this argument. And some of them say, well, we know this guy, and we know where he comes from, but the real Messiah, we're not going to know where he comes from, so he can't be the Messiah. And then later, in chapter 9, the Pharisees are talking to this man that was born blind that Jesus healed, and says, well, we know God spoke through Moses, but as for this guy, we don't even know where he came from, right? So they're disagreeing with themselves about the role that the Messiah is going to be and whether they're supposed to be able to recognize him or not. And really what John is exposing is just the fact that they were unwilling to see because of what it would require of them. And John says another thread and a theme that John has is about the light, right? And that those who live in the darkness are afraid to come into the light because for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But chapter 9 starts with the disciples saying, did this man sin or his parents? And Jesus says, neither, Rather, this man was born this way so that the work of God might be displayed. And as we find throughout the Gospels, Jesus' work of announcing the kingdom um, uh, happens primarily through a couple of things that I notice. One is parties, not as much in John as, say, in Matthew and Luke, but you've got parties where Jesus is breaking down walls and barriers and divisions that are based on race or ethnicity or social status or gender, all that kind of stuff. And the other thing is also rescuing and healing. And I mean that in the physical sense and also the spiritual sense. But this particular episode in chapter 9, where Jesus is healing the man that was born blind, has a particular double purpose as far as displaying the work of God. So first of all, of course, healing this man, right? This is inaugural work of the kingdom, right? To heal. And Jesus goes about this time and time again, oftentimes on the Sabbath, which didn't make the Jews very happy. But the second thing is exposing the blindness of the Pharisees, I think is really the primary reason that John fits this story in here where it is. Because at the end of chapter 9, the Pharisees say, so what? Are you saying that we're blind also? And that's when Jesus jumps into John chapter 10, talking about the good shepherd and the sheep. And something I think is really important to keep in mind with all of these New Testament passages with the sheep metaphors, it's really important to go back to Ezekiel 34, because Ezekiel 34 really envelops all of these things and is, I think, actually where Jesus is coming from in these parables, whether you're talking about the parable of the lost sheep, right, the one of the 99 that the good shepherd goes to find and brings back, or whether you're talking about the parable of the sheeps and the goats, putting one on his right and the others on his left, or whether you're talking about this one. All of those are really enveloped in Ezekiel chapter 34. And so, I want you to go back and look at that later if you haven't come across that chapter before. But God calls himself the shepherd. The sheep metaphor is intrinsically tied to God and his people. But even more specifically than that, the sheep metaphor is even more specifically talking about kingship. It's a kingship metaphor because a good king was supposed to act like and do the same things as a good shepherd, right? In fact, David was a shepherd before he was ever a king in the first place. And so I think that's where they really kind of honed in on this metaphor that's being used. So when you read the parable of the sheep and the goats, or all of those, what Jesus is basically saying as he is giving these parables in the Gospels, he's saying, God, Yahweh, who said all of that, here you go, right here, happening right now in front of your eyes in me. I only hope that you have the eyes to see it. And of course, many of them did not. Many would not recognize the voice of the shepherd. I don't know if you've ever done this, but if you just go on YouTube or something or do a quick Google search and type in sheep recognizing the voice of the shepherd, there are so many videos where you can watch people going out and trying to coax the sheep into coming in from far off or far away or whatever. And person after person is saying the same words, trying to do it the same way in the same intonation as the shepherd, and the sheep don't even budge. They don't even move a muscle. And then the shepherd goes out and does his thing in whatever way, and all the sheep start popping their heads up, and they start bounding in and coming in for food or to be led somewhere else. It's just one of these really amazing things. Or when you watch the Nature Channel or something like that, Animal Planet, and the one with the penguins always amazes me the most, because you'll have on this solid frozen tundra all of these mom penguins or dad penguins coming back and then there's just this enormous din of deafening sound coming from all of these chicks and these the other penguins that are wanting food, and they're calling and crying out for the one that's coming back in from the sea, amongst 100,000 other cries and chirps. And somehow, yet every time that one penguin is able to find the one single penguin that they're searching for, just based on sound. And it just seems like this supernatural, amazing thing that goes on in nature that I think is pretty awesome. But, our culture seems like that so often. There are so many opinions, so many people throwing out sounds into the air and on social media and all of that stuff. So many competing voices and opinions. And I like how Jeff ended, I think it was this past Sunday, that little one-liner of, we need to be on our knees more than we are on social media. And that really hit me, because then I had to kind of take stock, like, I wonder which one does outweigh right now. But if you're not before God in prayer, in humility and submission, there is no way you're going to be able to recognize his voice and his heart in this din of opinions that we're in right now. And I know it's not a red letter, but Paul says in Romans 12 something we're all pretty familiar with, when he says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. One, I think, litmus test of maybe discerning whether a voice is speaking the voice of Jesus or not is, are the words and the actions more about breaking down divisions and barriers and walls, or about rescuing and healing both physically and spiritually, or rather more about increasing divisions and leaving people behind without hope, without the hope of rescue or healing. Maybe that's just one way of helping us to discern what voices God is speaking through, and perhaps those that he's not. But a bit further down in John chapter 10, we find that it's the Festival of Lights, or the Feast of Dedication, or something that maybe we're all familiar with more, Hanukkah. And so what happened was, this was a feast. This is a feast, because they still do it today, that is in remembrance and honoring the Jewish revolt that happened 167 years before Jesus, led by Judas Maccabeus. Okay. And so he was a hero because he overthrew a tyrant that had come in and subjected the Jews once again, and had taken over the temple, and then began to honor these pagan gods, these false gods and idols, with sacrifices on the altar at the temple, which, of course, if you're a Jew, that's just, there's no greater blasphemy than that, right? And so he was a hero because he was able to get an army, lead a revolt, overthrow that tyrant, and kick them out. And then 3 years later to the day, he's able to rededicate the temple back to God. And then they start making sacrifices on the altar once again. And so, that really is about the most kingly thing that Judas could have done. They saw taking care of the temple and honoring the temple and kicking out those that were suppressing them, as that's what a king is supposed to do, right? And so they actually made Judas Maccabeus and his family kings, and they stay the kings of Israel for the next over 100 years, until, of course, Rome installs Herod as the king over the Jews. So this is essentially, Hanukkah, or the feast of um, uh, the feast of dedication, or the festival of lights. Same thing. This is essentially their July 4th, right? This is kind of Independence Day in a sense, uh, and so just keep that in mind. All right, this is a time when the Jewish people are thinking about God. They're thinking about liberation and freedom, being set free from their oppressors. It's a time when they're thinking about kings and how people become kings, right? So then in walks Jesus in the middle of this festival and this feast, talking about being the good shepherd, the actual shepherd who is giving his people real, true liberation into life abundant, who will show up all the others who went before him as being imposters and wolves and thieves. Can you imagine how that went over at that festival? Just think about going to New England on July 4th in the middle of a huge, giant stadium, and somebody has just sang the national anthem or something, and then you get the mic and you announce to thousands and thousands of people, and you say something like, actually, um, Great Britain still owns you, and George Washington was in fact a fraud, and I'm actually a bigger deal than all of those forefathers. Uh, Somebody is going to try to kill you, right? And sure enough, that's exactly what happens to Jesus as soon as he finishes talking about being the good shepherd, right? Who equating himself with that role that Yahweh himself claimed for himself from Ezekiel 34. And they try to kill him, they try to stone him. But it was so far beyond their paradigm, beyond what they could comprehend. They couldn't believe it even as it was happening right in front of them, right in front of their eyes. I love the words that God speaks in Habakkuk chapter 1. So Habakkuk the prophet, he's complaining about there being no justice. And God, why haven't you shown up and done something about this predicament that we're in? And God says in verse 5, open your eyes and stare, be astonished, be amazed, because I am doing something right now that you wouldn't even believe if I told you. And then, so just a couple chapters later in John chapter 12, you have Jesus saying, talking about going to the cross. And he says, but should I ask to be saved from this? No, it's for this reason that I came, right, to die on a cross. And at that moment, a voice from heaven says, I have glorified my name, and I will do it again through you. And you have a crowd of people that are around him, and it said some people recognized and heard the voice, and yet most of them just thought that it was thunder. Which reminds me of a song that means a whole lot to me. It's a song by Halal Worship, and it's called More Than Thunder. And I just wanted to read you just some of the lines from it. You calm the storm and walk on water. You heal the blind and raise the dead from earthly slumber. Some hear the voice of God and say, it's only thunder. But as for me, I stand amazed. You make the bread to feed the hungry. You turn the water into wine for all the thirsty. Some go away content and fail to see your glory. But as for me, I stand amazed. When mountains shake, I will not forget to praise you. When eagles soar, I will glorify your name. When lightning flashes, I will celebrate your wonder. Lord, may it always be to me more than thunder. And then there's actually another song that Halal sings that's very similar to that theme. It's basically a paraphrase of what Paul says in Philippians chapter 3. But the group sings this: all I once held dear and built my life upon, all this world reveres and wants to own. All I once thought gain, I have counted loss, spent and worthless now compared to this. Knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're my best, you're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord. And of course, both of those songs have several verses to them that I'm not going to read. But, just after I read this chapter in John 10 and how most of the people in the Gospel of John just were unwilling or unable to recognize Christ and his voice as the call of the Good Shepherd, my prayer is this: that you recognize the Spirit's call on your life, that you recognize it as something beautiful and as the very voice of God, and that with each step that you learn to know Christ more, so much so that your voice and your words and your actions are recognized as the very heart of God. God bless. I can't wait to be with you next week. Jeff and I are going to have a conversation about this theme, being known by God and knowing Christ. And so we're going to have a conversation a little bit about that. And also, that's going to be on Thursday instead of Wednesday, because next Wednesday is going to be our farewell gathering for David and Kelsey and Kenneth Criswell. So we hope to see you also for that. God bless. Bye.